Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and I'll be adding this to an ongoing playlist, Unlocking the Giza Plateau. It'll be more about, I want to have a look at what's referred to as the Egyptian mystery schools, and well, it seems to be a mystery exactly what they are. There are all sorts of interpretations but I want to focus on Thoth and Seshat. So Thoth and his female counterpart, sister or wife, Seshat. So throughout this series I've been especially looking at the Khafre Valley Temple and how the larger Giza complex forms a calendar, archaeoastronomy, and the links therein, for instance the causeway being 14 degrees bisecting the summer solstice, which would fall between the Great Pyramid and the Khafre Pyramid, and how that marks the Egyptian New Year, as also the beginning of the flood season of Akhet. That would be an alternate view. So here we have the Khafre Valley Temple and the Sphinx Temple, the Sphinx itself, and because of the grandeur of especially the Khafre Pyramid and the Great Pyramid, these things can be easily overlooked, but I think they carry information. And so it'll be about Thoth and Seshat. Thoth is the god connected to writing, astronomy, mathematics, geometry, surveying, medicine, botany, architecture, just knowledge and science in general, but weights and measures. And Seshat was the female counterpart, so she was the female version of Thoth, but even her name, she who scribed, she invented writing. Thoth taught it to humanity, and in many aspects she was the more superior in many ways, but at the very least that they were equal, and they both shared generally architecture, geometry, knowledge, science, but especially weights and measures being a very, very important feature, the basis of science. And so the 0 point, now you can see the doorway there, which already the angle of the Khafre Valley Temple's begun. So the 0 point would be directly underneath this door, or better yet would be standing on the top for a better observation point. For instance, this is a photo taken from the roof, and there you can see the causeway leading to the Khafre Pyramid and the Sphinx enclosure off to the side. An older picture again, so there we see the doorway, and still this is an older picture, so the sand and hasn't been cleared out, but yeah, your 0 point would be just move this fellow over here and he would be standing on this important central position. This is of course a reconstruction of what it may have looked like in the past, and we have the Khafre Valley Temple, and notice the waters coming right up to these docks. Now it doesn't happen anymore because for one reason the Nile has moved over time, but more importantly the High Aswan Dam has forever ended or at least while it exists, has ended the annual flood cycle, which was the heartbeat of ancient Egypt. And so in days, so any photo before 1970, you see the flood season, how the flood waters come right up to the very base of the Great Pyramid. Currently that's 8 kilometers or 5 miles to the Nile, so that's how far during the flood season the waters would expand out and come right to the very edge of the pyramid, which possibly was an excellent way to deliver the stones and everything that was needed in the construction. It was a vast project, and with these dockyards right up on the edge of the Khafre and Sphinx Temple. This is an older illustration. I think it's interesting. I couldn't confirm it, but so here we have, there would be the 0 point. You can see the door just beneath there. And we have this tower here on the side. Now that tower would be somewhere around about here in the Sphinx Temple. And so now this is a Google Earth view as you're approaching. So here we have the Khafre Valley Temple, the Sphinx Temple, the Sphinx of course, and we have that stone tower. Now that's relevant because just by standing on the roof of the Khafre Valley Temple, your survey point would be quite good, but just by adding a small tower, you could have a very, very good overview of the larger complex. Now, even just from the roof as it is now, you can see all of the bases of the 3 major pyramids. You can see Khafre's pyramid, which is this bulge off to the side. So you have a very good survey point to begin with. A small little tower would make it that much better. But older picture of Khafre Temple before it was brought out from the sand. Now here we have the T-shaped hall, and there you can see these very simple architecture. So just like at the Osiron, you have these very well fit walls, and you have columns, very simple columns without any decoration. That's a very important feature, very unusual feature in that sense as well. Which brings us to the pyramid. So the Great Pyramid, that's the surviving older picture of the surviving casing stones. There are only a few left on the north side. However, just before Petrie and the J.H. Cole survey, and for instance Petrie and J.H. Cole were the first very, very accurate surveys, just before they arrived, they had to remove all these stones from around the base of the Great Pyramid and Khafre Pyramid. Here we see so these are the casing stones and the type and the level of rubble which surrounded all of the base of the pyramid, which prevented earlier surveyors doing accurate work. And that's relevant because there is no hieroglyphs, there are no writings here at the Khafre Valley Temple. There are no hieroglyphs on the inside or the outside of the Giza pyramid, especially the Great Pyramid. Here we see these casing stones which were there at the time. The base was surrounded by high piles of rubble from the casing stones. Petrie and other explorers came across these. They made no report of any hieroglyphs on these casing stones. Such a find would have secured them fame and funding. There is only one report by El-Aldrisi in the 13th century AD that talks about the outside of the pyramids having hieroglyphs on them. Other contemporaries, well, they describe graffiti of other later languages. Earlier accounts, Herodotus, etc., all speak of smooth-sided pyramids. There was no writing on the outside of the Great Pyramid, the Khafre Pyramid, or any other pyramid for that instance. It just didn't happen. It wasn't until pyramids such as Unas and the pyramid text that we see writing on the inside. There is some writing at the stepped pyramid, but that's not a true pyramid. That's a stepped pyramid. None of the true pyramids have writing on the outside, and only later the very last pyramids had any writings on the inside. I'd love that there was writing on the outside, but it's just not there. There were so many casing stones up until and the early Egyptology. There's one account, and Al-Idrisi's account is very fanciful if you read it in its entirety. But so Khafre Pyramid, which is where the Great Pyramid, Menkaure Pyramid is, and we have Heliopolis, and down here we have the Osiron at Abydos, and what we have here is pyramids, no writing. Khafre Valley Temple, no writing, and at the Osiron, no writing. We have the same type of stonework as well. This is very rare, and it's limited to a very small number of sites. We also have the same style of architecture, just essentially big rectangular blocks. Just at the Osiron and also at the Khafre Valley Temple, you see these older images as well. So they share a form of architecture, a style, and also they share a distinct lack of writing, which is an important feature. So there's the Osiron. Here's a temple of Seti I at Abydos, and now there are attached tombs which have hieroglyphs and writing on them, but I'm talking about this Osiron specifically, not the attached parts, but the only markings there are these flowers of life, seed of life pattern, this very important geometric information. So we've got some geometry happening there. Now, as I showed in an earlier episode, this alignment of this temple is very important because it matches the 3-4-5 triangle, which is also the angle of the Khafre's pyramid, which is also a very important angle because it defines the 120 days of the season of Akhet as the sun moves across. So there's not just geometry, there's also astronomy in there, and that is a very important feature. And of course the 3-4-5 triangle being the first of the Pythagorean triplets, the Pythagorean mystery schools, and 3-4-5 triangle, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared, makes this a very important triangle, and this knowledge of course is just so important in science in general as a whole. So from Khafre Valley Temple, the Giza pyramids, and of course bent red pyramids, no writing, the Temple of Seti and Abydos, and then we go to Heliopolis, or Iunu, or On as it's called. That's mentioned several times in the Bible. There's nothing left of Heliopolis. It's now under a pile of rubbish. It's been some recent archaeology looking into there. There's a small open-air museum and one of the surviving obelisks. But the Heliopolis was the high priest of Heliopolis, which included Imhotep, was called the chief of the observers. It was also the primary sanctuary of the goddess Seshat, the goddess of wisdom, whose titles include foremost of the builders. Strabo, he describes visiting Egypt and talks about Heliopolis. So even after its decline, it was still considered one of the most important places. It was still famous for its astronomy, for its philosophy, and its geometry. And for instance, he mentions that both Plato and Eudoxus went through 13 years of training with the priests who excelled in their knowledge of the heavenly bodies, and also 365 days to fill out the true and a fraction of a day, so the understanding of the calendar as well, and how as he points out, that the Greeks and the Romans learnt this from the Egyptians and the Chaldeans, which Babylonian, Sumerian, the people of the Tigris, Euphrates. And that'll be an interesting feature because Plato, so we have the Neoplatonists or the Platonics, which are a mystery school. Now, Plato ran a academy. So later on, definitely there was an inscription over the door, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter my door." Whether it was in existence at the time of Plato might be debated, but in the period just after, where we still had these Neoplatonic, Platonic mystery schools, number cults have also been called, these secret academies. Essentially it's a secret science, secret university in essence as well. Well, this is an important feature because of course Plato's more famous for the Republic and his moral philosophy, but Plato was also, along with Pythagoras, were geometricians, and they based their philosophy on observing nature and were looking for natural patterns as well. Thales was famous for Thales' theorem. So if you draw a circle, draw a line across, wherever the point of the circle is will give you a right angled triangle. That's ever so important because with a right angled triangle, now we can apply Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras was the student of Thales. Both of them are said to have studied in Egypt. Thales is said to have measured the height of the Great Pyramid using some very simple but again profound geometry. And that's the thing with this ancient tech. With some very simple knowledge, with some very simple tools, you can survey, you can lift, you can do huge amounts with very, very little. It's just about applying this knowledge in a very profound way. And so Thales, Pythagoras, Plato, strong links to Egypt, and especially through Heliopolis. The primary sanctuary of Seshat, the chief of the observers, was the high priest there. So astronomy, philosophy, geometry, just science in general, this was ever so important part of the world. Since the Egyptian mystery schools are so mysterious, however, we do have documentation and text left over describing this geometry and this knowledge, which is most often attributed to the Greeks, of course, but as the Greeks and Romans say, they learnt from the Egyptians, the Babylonians, and of course they are also a transfer of knowledge from ancient India, which sort of brings us to the academies of Pythagoras and Plato. So the Pythagorean mystery schools, number cults as they're referred to, or the Platonic schools, these secretive academies. they were mystery schools where geometry was a core feature. They were very similar to the schools of the seven liberal arts, such as the great cathedrals of Cologne and Chartres, which have very strong links to later mystery schools such as Rosicrucians and Freemasonry. Freemasons, who of course have origin in Masonry, and again going back to the Roman Collegia and these other schools. So the Romans were building huge temples, moving massive stone all around the world, all around the Mediterranean world, and you need trained architects, you need trained people to do it. So where were their schools? Where were the universities? Well, they were something called the Collegia, and Romans were right on the doorstep of the of an industrial revolution. But then there was an internal civil war, and it all fell apart. But their origins lie in Egypt and the Chaldeans and these secretive schools in geometry. So Heliopolis was as Herodotus and others say, even at that time when Heliopolis was on the decline following the desecration of Cambyses, it was still the place where the most learned people of Egyptian history lived, where the philosophy and geometry, the astronomy was centered. Later it moved to the Library of Alexandria. So Alexander was crowned pharaoh. He established modern Alexandria, and there was the beginning of the great Library of Alexandria, and that became the center of record keeping, of science, etc. But what happened in Alexandria? Well, Heron of Alexandria, he was born in the Greek world. He came and lived and studied at the Library of Alexandria. The books and texts that he left included automatons based on steam power, automatic opening doors, robots, like music boxes with little dancing figures on the top. He also wrote on surveying techniques, also on lifting equipment, and you even wrote a book on how to lift massive weights. So that's important because the Romans were moving massive obelisks, not just along the Nile, they were moving them to Rome and then moving them across land much further than what was moved in the past. How were the Romans able to move these massive stones and obelisks? Did they invent this on their own, or were they learning from the Egyptians and Chaldeans and looking at these earlier texts? This is the Pillar of Pompeii. In Alexandria, the largest single column in the world, has a Roman Corinthian capital on the top. Granite brought from Mons Claudianus quarry site. And again, so how are they able to lift and move these things? Well, in books such as those by Heron or Vitruvius, they describe not just machines, but they describe the principles behind lifting them, allowing other engineers to apply the principles and tailor-make a piece of equipment to that particular point. So Heron, of course there was continual development in there, but how much of Heron's work was based on the text that he was privy to inside the Library of Alexandria? For instance, the aqueducts that the Romans built, they are more precisely surveyed than the Great Pyramid. So it's often stated how close to nearly true perfect north the Great Pyramid is, 0.05 of a degree. Well, the Roman aqueducts were at a grade of 1/4800. So every 4,800 meters, they dropped 1 meter. That's how accurate they were. And Heron also wrote about the surveying tools used to find this, and this was through the air as well. So how were the Romans able to achieve this? How were the Greeks able to achieve this? Of course, they would have developed their own and furthered knowledge, and people are inventive, but how much of it actually come through their contact with ancient cultures such as the Chaldeans and the Babylonians, heir of Sumer? Well, that's an interesting question, because also Aristarchus of Samos, as in Pythagoras of Samos, very important place, this island of Samos, but they came to study in Egypt, and Aristarchus also studied at the Great Library. He published on heliocentric model. He also spoke about precession of the equinoxes, or the movement of the North Pole as it moves around. So again, how much of this was purely his own study, and how much of it was based on this ancient library where all this knowledge was gathered. So was it pure invention, purely new discovery, or was it actual rediscovery of older knowledge as well? Another famous librarian at the Library of Alexandria was Eratosthenes, famous for his work on prime numbers, but also on his early measurements of the Earth, the polar circumference of the Earth. So he went to where is Aswan now, where the Tropic of Cancer would be 23.5 degrees. Now, the exact location of the Well of Syene has been lost, but based on the surviving story, on June 21st at noon, the summer solstice no less, the sun would shine precisely down the well. It wouldn't leave a shadow. Well, if that's the case, it would have to be on the Tropic of Cancer, which would be not too far south, but very close to, a little bit south of Aswan. And then by the same day, on June 21st, he measured at Alexandria the shadow cast by obelisk. From that angle, knowing the distance between those two sites, he made a very good approximate of the polar circumference of the Earth, 250,000 stadia. Now, what exactly is a stadia? That's a very difficult question to answer, but it is interesting that 7.2 degrees is 432 minutes of the compass, or 29,920 seconds of the compass. And the subdivision of degrees into minutes and seconds we'll come back to in a moment. But that's also relevant because of the first day, the Egyptian New Year, Arket, the beginning of a flood season. That's when the sun sets directly in between the Khafre and the Great Pyramid as well, a very important date. Pliny and later writers reported Eratosthenes' measurement as 252,000 stadia. Again, the definition of exactly what is a stadia is, it could be anywhere from 1/10 of a mile to, so basically 528 feet to 660 feet, depending. But even it's very good approximate or perfect, depending on your definition of the stadia. But either way, it's very good. Later Roman developments, Claudius Ptolemy, for instance, he was unsatisfied with the measures of the Earth available. So he used angular observations of the stars, and he wanted to base the map on distance, but he was unsatisfied with the measures of the Earth that were available at the time, so he used angles, and he actually was this ancient Roman map. How do you transfer a spherical map onto a flat map? Well, this goes back quite some time, and actually the development of longitude and latitude goes back to this era, where the world was divided into meridians of longitude and latitude and using degrees, as we still use now. Which is an important question about the origin of a 360-degree circle. In the previous episode in that series, I talked about the 360-day calendar, which was used in Babylon, Sumer, and Egypt, which is a compromise between the lunar and the solar calendar, but this division of a circle into 360 degrees. Well, Aristarchus was dividing a circle into 360 degrees, but also then each degree was divided into 60 arc minutes. Very important feature. Now we use decimals, but for instance, a slope angle of a pyramid is 51 degrees and 51 minutes. Then each minute is divided into 60 seconds of the compass. So both the clock of time, but the compass to measure degrees, each hour is divided into 60 minutes, each minute divided into 60 seconds. We have the same thing happening with the compass. Now, when did this exactly emerge? This is probably never going to be answered, but we do know it goes back quite some time, at least the concept of 60 arc minutes. We know that the influence of the base 60 number system of the Sumerians and Babylonians was the origin of this. It still defines so much of a modern world. So at the very least, that concept, if it didn't exist, it was like one logical step away. That was already in the toolbox. Now that's an important feature because, for instance, in the Rig Veda, they also speak of 360 like spikes, pegs. 12 spokes, one wheel, navels free. Who can comprehend this? On it placed together, 360 like pegs. They shake not in the least. the influence of Indian mathematics and astronomy, very important feature as well. So what was happening in Alexandria, they had the lifting technology to move these megaliths. They left the text not just describing the machines, but also the principles. They clearly understood these elements, and as we can be seeing clearly, because they moved these massive obelisks not just along the Nile, they actually moved them across the Mediterranean, over the Apennine into Rome itself. They had very excellent surveying. They were looking at geodesy, earth-based measure systems, also looking at the relative size of the Earth and the Moon and starting to investigate that, predicting eclipses and using eclipses as the tool for measurement. Also, of course, geometry and measurements of time, as they themselves tell us, especially from Heliopolis, this was transferred. So we have the Library of Alexandria. How much of this knowledge was purely discovered at that time, or how much of it was relics of Greco-Roman scholars and other people coming to Alexandria, reading the old texts and finding these? So did Eratosthenes create that model using the well of Syene to measure the size of the Earth? Or was he simply replicating an older Egyptian experiment? Well, we don't know, but it is a possibility, because the development of these sciences and the texts that we survive now from the Greco-Roman period, well, if the Romans were able to measure and to move these things, so how did the Egyptians do it? Well, I think it's more logical, if you want to understand the mystery schools, where did the Greco-Roman people learn it from? Right here. And what they were doing, yes, it's an important feature. So back to the archaeoastronomy, the calendar system of the Giza Plateau, and so from the 0 point to the midpoint between autumn and winter solstice, that points directly to the Menkaure pyramid, which creates a 42-degree angle. Now that distance is at or very, very close to, it's difficult to be super precise, but 3,043.23 feet, could be a little bit either way. Very, very close to 1/2 of a nautical mile. A nautical mile is based on a 1 arc minute of the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So you get the circumference, equatorial circumference of the Earth divided by 21,600, as in there are 21,600 minutes in 360 degrees. That's where the nautical mile comes from. Now that distance just happens to be the perimeter of the Great Pyramid, including the sockets. Done some earlier videos on that. I mentioned that what we have are these cornerstones at each of the corner of a pyramid, which give it a little bit of extra base dimension. So a little bit exaggerated there because they're only 2 feet. But that's something that's basically what the sockets are. They add a little bit of length to the base of the pyramid. And using the surveys, from Menkaure's pyramid to the 0 point is the perimeter of the Great Pyramid, including the sockets. Now that's a very important feature, because if we multiply that by 43,200, we get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. There are a few different ways of doing it, so whether you use 43,200, 86,400, or 1728.00, but they all come in together, and there's some nice information in regards to that, and the sophistication of geometry, earth, metry measure, earth measure, geodesy, and the ancient Egyptians. Now you might, if you're unfamiliar with the pyramid and its relationship with the size of the Earth, you might say, well, 43,200 is an arbitrary number because I could take any object, divide the size of the Earth by that number, and therefore say it's representative of the size of the Earth. Well, first we must examine why this particular number is so important, 43,200 or 432. We saw earlier that Eratosthenes measured the Earth, 7.2 degree angle. 7.2 degrees is 432 minutes of the compass. That's one reference we saw already. But It's well, 43,200. So now let's look at the ancient Indian traditions, and we have the yugas, where Kali Yuga, 432,000 years, Para Yuga, 864, Treta Yuga, 1296. Interesting to note, now a compass is 360 degrees, or 21,600 minutes, or 1,296,000 seconds of a 360 degree compass. Now we have the Satya Yuga, 1728,000 years, all totaled there 432,000 or 4.32 million years is the complete Yuga. Now I could also bring up the Mayan calendar and the important how their number systems reflect these particular numbers, but that's one instance of 432 or 432,000 or 4.32 million. Now that's one order of magnitude off, but also let's look at the Sumerian kings list. And earlier episodes we talked about the links between the Sumerian calendar and the ancient Egyptian calendar. Well, we have a very important set of numbers in this kings list, but 43,200 included. Now we'll be looking at 288, for instance, in a moment. 288, 288, 288. But 43,200 years, that's the precise number we need also to multiply to get the size of the Earth. But this set of numbers is very important across ancient cultures, even including Mayans, for instance. But so we come back to the 0 point. Now, Arket, summer solstice, is the beginning of Arket, even symbolically matches the sun setting between the two pyramids on the summer solstice, is the beginning of the Arket, the flood season of 120 days. The sun will move 37 degrees, 36.87 is the angle of the Khafre pyramid. The precise number that the sun would move is within a fraction of a degree of that, but 120 days equals 2,880 hours. The Egyptians certainly divided their days into hours and would have been familiar with that. Now it just so happens that so 42 degrees, or 42 would be to complete it, but 48 degrees angle of a pyramid. Well, there are 60 minutes per degree. 48 times 60 is 2,880 minutes of the compass. And therefore, that's 1728.00 seconds of a compass is 48 degrees, and 120 days is 1728.00 minutes of time. Measuring angles, measuring time, the clock, and the compass. This goes to the argument of, were the Egyptians using the 360 degree, or they had 360 days, but the 360 degree division of the greater circle? Well, we'll just label that coincidence for the moment. But when it comes to this well, let's firstly 2,888. This is a very important number. So firstly, let's begin. The Tetractys was where the Pythagoreans swore their oath. You'll find this, for instance, Heinrich Kunrath and all these Hermeticists, alchemists, were embedding this within their symbolism. And we also see the Tetragrammaton, or the name of God, which is also represented, just like the Tetractys, a triangle of 4 levels, which has lots of information in it, especially music theory. But so the Tetractys, or the Tetragrammaton, very, very important in these ancient esoteric circles and these old mystery schools, for instance, Enoch or the Pythagorean and Platonics. Now when it comes to the Tetractys, well, 1 plus, it's nicely links to 33 via the factorials. Now if you multiply the factorials of 1, 2, 3, 4, you also get 288. So 33, very, very important in Rosicrucian Freemasonry, but of even ancient, for instance, 33 gods on Mount Meru, the symbolism in Bible and older ancient texts, very important number. But 288, it's even 288 divine sparks in creation according to some Kabbalists, but this is a very important number. And it also works out that in 4 dimensions it's very perfect, because 1 to the first times 4, or 2 squared, times plus 127 or 3 cubed plus 256 or 4 to the fourth, 1 to the fourth plus 2 to the second plus 3 to the third plus 4 to the fourth equals 288. Now if you do it in the opposite direction and multiply them, 1 to the fourth times 2 to the third times 3 to the second times 4 to the first also equals 288. Again, cross time, cross cultures is a very important number. And that's also in the 288, 288, 288, also in the King's List. Also the way that the yugas are divided down into the entry and the exit between each of the yugas, you'll again find these very important set of harmonic numbers, and we'll look at those more in a second. But yes, these important number systems. So one season of 120 days is 2,880 hours. 48 degrees is the corner angle of the pyramids, of the Great Pyramid. 2,880 minutes of the compass. Then we also have 1728.00 and 1728.00. Now 1728 is a very important number. For instance, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where it describes the preserver of life, or the ark, to survive the flood, 120 by 120 by 120 cubits, that's 1728.000 cubic cubits. New Jerusalem is 12,000 by 12,000 by 12,000 furlongs. So again, the volume of New Jerusalem also brings us to this important number. 1728 is 12 cubed. Here is what's called the harmonic numbers. So it's basically 2 to the first, 2 to the second, 2 to the third, so 4, 8, and then across the top 3 to the first, 3 to the 3 squared, 3 cubed, 3 to the fourth, etc. And there we have these particular set of what's called the harmonic numbers. Amongst them is 288, 1728, and 432, the numbers we've already seen. Now 864 and 1296, well, they're the numbers used in the yugas. Now you could look at the Mayan calendar system. It's all on the harmonic chart as well. In Angkor Wat and these other sacred numbers used across Hindu and Buddhist tradition, it's all on the harmonic numbers. And okay, also have 5184. Well, that works out nicely because the slope angle of the pyramid is 51.842773 degrees ideally, but of course there's slight variation, so 51.84 would be a very nice description of a pyramid. I've done a whole series on these harmonic numbers and how they relate to ancient measure systems, also measures of sun, earth, and moon, and how they relate to modern science and technology, radio and screen resolution. It's just, yeah, it's all there. But musically speaking, we have what's the Pythagorean tuning. So we have this set of numbers here, and they relate to C, G, D, A, E, and B. And you'll notice that they're all at a ratio of 2 to 3 or 3 to 2, which is the Vesica Pisces, which is the perfect fifth in music theory, and again is a constant across ancient and modern esoteric architecture. There is geometry in the humming of the strings. There is music in the spacing of the spheres. Pythagoras, these schools. Now that 3 to 2 ratio is also Khafre pyramid, as well as all I showed in episode 4. All these other pyramids, Pepi 1, 2, etc., also have this 3 to 2 ratio, which gives us the 3, 4, 5 triangle, the first of the Pythagorean triplets. And the numbers and the connections to there, for instance, 666 has been connected as well, but 288, 216, 360, these are all harmonic numbers as well. So 216, we go back to, okay, 216 and 36 or 360, how these relate to this particular system as well. For number is within all of things. It's attributed to Pythagoras, but let's go back to the Osiron and that flower of life and how it relates to the Vesica, the 2 to 3. Now, okay, before we go, you'll notice that 2 and 3 are the beginning of the actual series in the harmonic numbers as well, which brings us to the Vesica. Now the Osiron, the flower of life, well, it's just a geometry of overlapping Vesica Pisces. That's all that geometry comes from, and it contains information. Pythagorean Platonic mystery schools, well, the Parthenon is overflowing with astronomical geometric information as well, and it's caught, so the length to the width is 9 to 4, the width to the height is 9 to 4, that's, or 3 squared to 2 squared, 2 to 3. Now in regards to the 3, 4, 5 triangle, so old television screens were 3, 4 to 3, therefore the diagonal would be 5, and now we've moved to 16 by 9, which is 4 squared to 3 squared as well. So for all that, just emerging from the Vesica. I'll put a link in the description to Symmetry Festival 216 J. Caprath. He also highlights the work of Anne Balkans looking at the Parthenon, and you'll see 3 to 2, 4 to 3, 4 to 3. Hidden geometry, astronomy, musical proportions within the Parthenon, the stonework. There are no right angles in the stone. It's all, people think that it's blocks of right angles. No, it's actually precisely fitted stone with ever so gentle curves across the whole thing, but also how the geometry in the Parthenon relates to ancient Indian architecture, where we're seeing again these secret societies, fraternal organizations, secret academies of architects, stonemasons, geometricians passing on ancient knowledge, just as with what is happening at the pyramids and also these other temples as well. So the School of Athens, where we see Zoroaster, Pythagoras, Plato, and these other greats of geometry and science and astronomy. Well, let no one ignorant of geometry enter my door was on the Platonic schools, because this is their language that they're writing in. There's no writing on Caffre Valley Temple. There's no writing at the Osiron. There's no writing at the Great Pyramids. But there is writing, and it can be read through geometry. Secret fraternities, academies, the Pythagorean or Platonic number cults as they're called, and these same symbols, which makes great fiction for Dan Brown. But what we see is that this ancient tradition of these number cults, these geometricians, astronomy, music, arithmetic, geometry, being passed on and hidden in plain sight. And of course there are so what we have a grom of it. That's the Eleusinian mysteries. You would see the preacher's hand, which is used by the Pope still now. Also the Mithraic schools, where if you look at their symbolism, again it's containing astronomical, lots of geometry in there as well. If it's read through that sense, it actually brings information. So the pyramid, the angles. Now even the 42-degree angle, I won't go into this episode, but that's 42 degrees is 2,520 minutes of the compass, or 1,512.00 seconds of the compass. The base length, maximum visible of the pyramid, is 1512 anyway, but there's layers of information, geometry, metrology, it can be read. And you just got to get around the fact that they weren't just purely superstitious people, that they were geometricians, they were metrologists, they were measuring, they were observing, and there we see. So these numbers is in the Sumerian kings list, it's in the Epic of Gilgamesh, it's in the Yugas, it's also in the Mayan calendar, it's in the ancient Greek and Roman weights and measure systems. I did a whole series on those harmonics, so hours long just going through that. This is pretty clear. But now let's look at the base length of the pyramid. If I multiply that by 1728.00, I get the equatorial circumference of the Earth. I just include the sockets as is necessary to scale it. But that number, exact number, multiplied by the base length, gives us the equatorial circumference of the Earth. So whether it's the 120 days with 2,880 hours, or 172,800 minutes, which is reflected in the number of seconds in a 48 degrees compass, or the number of minutes in 48 degrees of the compass. And this goes back to the question of the origin of a 360-degree compass divided into 60 minutes per degree and 60 seconds per minute. However, at the very dawn of Sumer and the Old Kingdom, all the elements were there, and so perhaps it's been lost in time, but perhaps it's just a coincidence, yet it is a very lovely set of coincidence if that's the case. Now, staying on the Great Pyramid, and we're including the sockets again, so we're looking at basic 760.75 feet to 760.89 feet being the base length of each side of a pyramid. Well, so let's just call it 760.8 feet for the moment. If you draw a diagonal through any of the three pyramids at Giza, or the Great Pyramid, you draw a diagonal, that will point not only to Heliopolis, but it will actually point directly to the sacred mound, the Ben mound of creation, the birthplace of the Ennead. And from the corner of the pyramid, so I've drawn the line, but from that corner of the pyramid to Heliopolis and the Ben mound is 76,800 feet. And again, you could take away a slight fraction either way, you'll still be within. Well, that turns out to be 100 times the base length of the Great Pyramid, including the sockets. So you just multiply that distance by 1728, and again you're getting the Earth's equatorial circumference above 99.95%. Also, there's, even so, if you Google the size of the Earth, they'll give you a specific number, but what needs to be accounted for is that the fact when you measure whether the diameter, so the diameter is just, the circumference is its diameter times pi, but when they measure the diameter of the Earth, if you were to take this snapshot at that moment where it's over land, well, the African highlands is going to add a significant amount of distance, and alternatively on the other side, so ideally you'd want to get it where it's water on both sides, so the diameter or the circumference of the Earth, there's margins of definition in there. That number that you get just by doing a Wikipedia search is an average. It's not a absolute measurement. It's similar to the coastline paradox. It's when you measure and how you measure, and this number will vary ever so slightly, and the margin of error is within this margin of error as well. So it's essentially 100% accurate depending. But sticking with Heliopolis, I showed an earlier episode, the angle itself of Heliopolis matches the angle of the Caffre Valley, of the causeway to the Caffre Pyramid from the 0 point. And it also happens to be that within there we also have 42 and 48 degrees of the slope of the corner angles of the pyramid as well, which gave us all those rather lovely numbers. So geometry, geo, earth, metry, measure. The Platonic, Pythagorean, Collegian, and these other mystery schools, and that common concept, let no one ignorant of geometry enter my door. They inherited this knowledge, as they say themselves. For instance, in Strabo and Herodotus and Diodorus, they claim, this is no secret. And how much did they discover for themselves, but how much was directly passed on from Heliopolis or through the collections which were later to be found at the Library of Alexandria. So the Egyptian mystery schools are a mystery, but we can piece together, we can build a case to see what the ancients who inherited Egyptian knowledge, including the lifting technology, etc., what and how were they able to do it. They left us very clear documentation on that fact, and that this particular systems that they were using blend ever so nicely into the individual pyramids and the greater plan. Also found that these other temples, this I believe provides part of a very, very important key. And so Caffre Valley Temple, the 0 point, now even the angles and the numbers there is quite a bit of info, but I'll end this episode now just to introduce, because I believe at the architecture of the Caffre Valley Temple, the Osiron, the pyramids, and also at Heliopolis are painting a very clear picture that these mystery schools of Egypt were very similar to the Pythagorean and Platonic schools, where geometry, astronomy, and specific numbers, the same numbers that tie into the sacred numbers in ancient India, sacred numbers to the Mayans, sacred numbers to societies, right up until the modern day, and modern architects like I.M. Pei, Norman Foster, Daniel Libeskind are in plain sight are embedding this same particular system over and over again. It's measurable, it's tangible, it's testable, Coincidence, law. What's the metric for coincidence? If there's enough coincidences, then it becomes a pattern. Where does that point begin? Well, it's an ideological one, whether you want to accept the fact that there is a possibility that they are much more mathematically, scientifically advanced in the past than what the common text would say, or you could really just say, well, no, I don't want to believe it. And that's what I think it comes down to, whether you want to accept the common narrative of primitive ancients and that we're at the peak of knowledge and civilization, or that there's a possibility that they were able to achieve with simple tools. For instance, most of the mathematical astronomical advances that were made were done in a period prior to electronics and satellites, and they were able to do it with very simple tools. The Romans were able to do these things with very simple tools, yet there's I would say both on the alternative and on the mainstream, to look at Egyptians and not connect these very simple tools used with high logic and how they're able to advance. If the Enlightenment and Renaissance were able to do these things without electronics, if the Romans were able to do it without electronics, why were not older civilizations able to do it when the Romans said we learnt from them? I think this is a very important feature. Yeah, hello SGD. Before I begin this video, if you've just watched the previous part in regards to Seshat and the mystery schools and how they connect to Pythagorean, Platonic and up to Rosicrucians, Freemasons, you can skip the first 15 minutes because I'm just reviewing the last episode. So yeah, if you've just come off the previous episode, just go to the 15-minute mark, and otherwise it's a review. If you haven't seen the other part or want to hang around and watch the first 15 minutes for a review, well, you can do that too, but first 15 minutes you can skip it if you've just watched part 1. Hello SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded. This will be part 2, and looking at the ancient Egyptian mystery schools with a focus on Thoth, also Djibouti, also called, but Seshat and She Who Scribes. I've done an earlier series on Seshat and Heliopolis, and I'll be adding to it because of this. I've been looking at this concept of the 0 point at the Khafre Valley Temple, how that creates a calendar, and the archaeoastronomy with the solstice, winter and summer, as well as the equinoxes, and how some other connections coming back to Seshat. And the Khafre Valley Temple, which has this T-shaped hall with this very simple block technique, as well as those fitted walls, which is very unusual in comparison to the typical Egyptian architecture. And just like the pyramids, no writing, no hieroglyphs on there. There were the casing stones. There has been one old chronicler from the 13th, 14th century spoke of coverings of hieroglyphs, but the old photos before the casing stones were removed from the base, there were no hieroglyphs on that pyramid or any pyramid. Only later with the smaller pyramids such as Unas, Pepi, etc. did we have the pyramid text being written on the inside. So Khafre Valley Temple, this form of architecture, very simple, essentially geometric, just like the pyramids, and also has at the Osiron, very similar style. And of course at the famous Flower of Life is geometry at the Osiron as well, and that I want to go more into this in the future. The size and the shaping of the blocks, in early looking, I've just looked at it briefly, but there's fruit here. It's going to bear fruit from what's happening, but there is a language written in this stone which can be accessed through astronomy, geometry, arithmetic and music, the quadrivium. These are the areas of Thoth and Seshat. So also as in the earlier series, earlier videos in the series in regards to unlocking the Giza Plateau, so whether it was at Thebes, Abydos, Elephantine, all these places across Egypt, the geometry of the layout is a repeated pattern that can be found inside at the not just the individual pyramids such as Khafre, but the larger complex at the Giza pyramids and how they relate, of course, to the seasons and the sun, solstice, equinox, etc. And how these mystery schools have the same themes that are so important in the Pythagorean schools, the Platonic schools, and these other mystery schools leading up to the alchemists and the hermeticists of the Renaissance, leading to Freemasonry, Rosicrucians, the early Theosophists, and this very interesting, where there was an explosion of knowledge and science and geometry. Well, we have the same, and beautiful architecture. Each period in history seems to be following the same pattern of this essentially geometric underpinnings to all of it. So the pyramids, the writing is geometry, it's in astronomy. There is no written text, but the text is the stone itself. By understanding the proportions and the metrology, just like at Khafre Valley Temple and just like at the Osirion. Now let's look at the Temple of Seti I at Abydos, very famous because it includes a king's list, but the king's list only begins with Nama at Temple of Seti I. It excludes a lot of important kings. I think it's much better to look at the Nama palette and the royal annals and these older kings lists which have these pre-dynastic kings in there. But so from Temple of Seti I, also we're going to visit again and look at Heliopolis, City of the Sun, or Iunu, or On as it's called. It's mentioned a few times in the Bible as well. So Heliopolis now, it's in the suburbs of Cairo. The whole place was torn to shreds and the stone was recycled to make a lot of those large mosques and public buildings in Cairo. They used casing stones, yes, but that's on the other side of a river. Heliopolis was a huge complex, and that was the major source for a lot of the stonework in Cairo. Whereas Strabo, Herodotus, they speak of the importance of Heliopolis as a center of astronomy, of timekeeping, and science, philosophy in general. I mentioned earlier how Plato, Eudoxus, the ancients tell us, were initiated in Heliopolis and for Platonic schools. So whether it was at the time of Plato, but definitely later, shortly after, let no one ignorant of geometry enter my door. So just like with Thales and Pythagoras, who also were said to have studied in Egypt, and this explosion of Greco-Roman knowledge being so closely linked to the ancient Egyptians and Babylonians, Chaldeans. So these mystery schools, Plato and Pythagoras, and how they're so important, for instance, to the liberal arts at Chartres or Cologne. These cathedrals, which are again embedded with geometry and arithmetic and metrology, and that the building is the textbook. It's not a nice published book with ISBN number, but the buildings themselves encode this knowledge and how that was so important and to be found in Rosicrucian, Freemason texts and imagery. So Heliopolis was the center by the time of Alexander and the Ptolemaic era. Alexandria and the Library of Alexandria became the center of learning. People such as Heron of Alexandria with automatons, steam engines, self-opening doors, also who wrote very scientific textbooks on surveying, on lifting, and these technologies. So to lift massive blocks of stone, which they did, they also left us the text to do it. So this would be the best way to get an understanding of how pre-Greco-Romans did it, because they learnt from the Library of Alexandria, and they were able to do it with simple technology, and they left us very clear-cut records on that. And also the astronomy, such as Aristarchus of Samos, who was a student at the Library of Alexandria. His heliocentric and precession texts survive and were written about and developed by others. Then the geocentric version come back in, and then eventually, of course, we come back to heliocentric version. But this Eratosthenes measuring the size of the Earth, prime numbers, and these types of things. So how much of this knowledge was a development at the library, or was it a reconstruction of older texts? So Eratosthenes used the well of Syene he knew that on the summer solstice that the sun would shine directly into the well, and then on the same day, on the solstice, he would measure the angle at Alexandria to measure the polar circumference of the Earth. Was this something that he discovered purely on his own, or was he just rediscovering these ancient texts? And this idea of geometry, earth, metry, measure, also concepts such as the 360-degree compass and mapping technology, which goes again back to the Roman times. So again, was this such as longitude and latitude? We think of that as being more modern, but it was actually done in ancient times, and was it purely a discovery of the Romans at Alexandria and such other centers, other libraries, or was it a rediscovery of ancient knowledge? Well, as we saw in part one, it's even in the Rig Vedas and these ancient Indian texts as well, because just like with Babylonians, there's evidence that they had the Archimedes screw, but they described it in a language that is unusual to us, as where Archimedes, Heron, Vitruvius, these Greco-Roman writers, they write in a language that is very understandable. It's essentially the same as our modern texts, scientific texts. But if you look at the older ancients and you read it through that lens of science, and just understand what their language was and their description. So we think of a screw, we have a certain image of it. The Babylonians have a description of an Archimedes screw to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. There's a lot of great evidence to suggest they had an Archimedes screw to deliver the water to the garden. It has always been one of the mysteries of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, how they were able to deliver the water. And they describe the spiral shape of a palm tree. There's been some great studies and looks into that, and well, yeah. So how much of the Greco-Roman Archimedes and these type of people is actually a rediscovery and just translated into Greek and Latin, which forms the basis of the modern languages that we use now? But that these concepts of 360 degrees divided into 60 minutes, divided into 60 seconds, seems to be a legacy of the ancients. But so to understand the ancients, well, let's look at the ancients who left us records from places such as Alexandria and Heliopolis, and we see that there is a strong case to suggest that they were just simply publishing information that has survived and been passed on to us now. But whether it's lifting massive stones, surveying with great precision, measuring the earth, measuring time, well, the Greeks and Romans are pointing to us back to Alexandria, and especially back to Heliopolis. And that's going to be an important theme. So how, again, with the 0 point and the distances and the angles, we have geometry, earth, measure, evidence there. The same systems, these beautiful numbers, harmonic numbers, Pythagorean tuning being the basis for this. And it can be found, again, cross cultures as well. They always seem to be coming back to these numbers, whether it's the Indians, the Sumerians, and it just, yeah, lovely tie into so many examples of those harmonic numbers. Now, I did mention 288 and 432, but I didn't highlight it in the last video. For instance, D is 288 Hertz. In Pythagorean tuning, 432 Hertz is A. And they are at this 2-to-3 ratio, the perfect fifth, or it's referred to as a Hermetic constant, which emerges from the Vesica Pisces, Pythagorean tuning, Pythagorean theorem, the geometry, those mystery schools, and again those ratios between, which is embedded in not just ancient Egyptian architecture, but right up until the modern era, especially connected to masonry. So more on these harmonic numbers. I'll put the playlist in the description where I go through the whole, and you'll see just whether it's 144, 288, 864, 108, I go through the whole series and show the geometry, the astronomy, the arithmetic, weights and measure systems of the ancients, even how it's embedded in modern systems of science. I'll also, because it's related, I did a series on the pentagram and how the pentagram and the angles contained in there have this, for instance, 288. The same system is repeated, and with very simple geometry, 360 degrees is in 360 days in the old calendars. yeah, it's some really lovely stuff going on in there. I just think it's hidden in plain sight. Pythagorean theorem and those connections again to Egyptian architecture. That geometry again, of course, in the Osiron, in the Flower of Life, all based on the Vesica, as you know, the old 4x3 or 16x9 modern resolution, which is embedded in the pyramids, but the Parthenon, the great cathedrals, even in stone circles, places such as Karnak in France. So these secret fraternities, or these academies such as Pythagoras and Plato, often referred to as number cults, but the Egyptian influence on greats such as Pythagoras and Plato, or Zoroaster and the alchemy therein, and also just the philosophy in general, it's always pointing us back to the ancients, and the Greeks and Romans, etc., tell us quite explicitly they learnt it from the Babylonians and Chaldeans and the Egyptians. So that's now what we find is it's more makes great fiction, but the Rosicrucians, or especially the Freemasons, because they're the most famous, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, music, the quadrivium, and how, of course, a geometric symbolism, the compass and square, the 3-4-5 triangle, this ancient lovely knowledge which goes, I would say, goes back much further than the traditional viewpoint is, that it emerged from the Greek period. Well, it's part of a very ancient tradition, of course, as in the Sumerian kings list, 288, 432, 108, 360, etc. Also in the Bible, in descriptions such as New Jerusalem, which is exactly the same as the Epic of Gilgamesh, just with a couple zeros added at the end. These particular sets of numbers, Sumerian, the Yugas, and also in the Rig Veda, also how they connect to the angles of the Great Pyramid, which of course links us to the 120 days. It's the same sets, same numbers, just expressed one in angles, one in time. And of course then we lead us to geodesy, earth measure, geometry, in all sorts of formats. So, and again, not just the Great Pyramid, but just to focus on the Great Pyramid, diagonal points exactly to the Heliopolis, the sacred mound. The base length of the pyramid, including the sockets, times 100 is a distance from the closest corner to Heliopolis, and that also has this geodetic information in there. And of course the alignment and arrangement of Heliopolis itself is just reflecting the Great Pyramid, also the causeway to the Khafre Pyramid, and those connections with that astronomy. So now, geometry, geo, earth, metry, measure, these academies, secret societies, fraternities, number cults, would call them what you will. And back to the 0 point. Now, the Khafre Valley Temple, here we see an example of that stonework, which is very rare, limited basically to the Khafre Valley Temple or the Osiron, places that have no writing, but have this geometry in there, just like the pyramids themselves. So we see the T-shaped hall, and again those blocks and that form of stonework, very similar to the stonework in, for instance, the Parthenon, no straight lines, all right angles. So now that's your Khafre Valley Temple style. There we have a more typical Egyptian form of architecture. The Khafre Valley Temple and the Osiron, very different. And of course the Osiron does have the Flower of Life. Now let's look at Temple of Seti I at Abydos with that King's List. That's also the angle reflecting the Khafre Pyramid, which is the angle reflecting the movement of the sun over the 120 days of the season. So that's the outside to the main part of the temple as it's now. There has been some reconstruction, restoration work, but you do see the carvings out there. Now that's they're not circular on the outside. There's circular round columns inside, but on the out, but inside and out it's very richly decorated. It is the typical Egyptian style. We can see the inside the round columns, and of course on the inside a lot of this beautiful artwork with the original pigments still survives. On the outside, it's been faded, and so we do see traces of this color, but what it looks there's on the inside, this is how it would have looked in the olden times. This is how these temples used to look. Same with, for instance, the Parthenon. The statues, for instance, their lips would be painted red, their hair would be painted in colors. The temple would be whitewashed and, in lime, very beautiful, very white, very different. Now, because of a tourism trade, there's a tendency not to restore the temples to their original when they do restoration work, because the tourists want to see them like this. But in former days, in their glory, this whole would have been brilliant colours. He's raising the Jed and his Thoth with his two rods, Lower and Upper Egypt, coming together. And now, Temple of Seti I has multiple references to Seshat in there, very important. So, just as you enter, you would see, again, you see the 7 points there above, and the scribe. She's even got the scribe tools there. It's maybe a bit hard to make out, and the palm frond. Stretching the cord ceremony with Seshat in there. Because of the screenshots where I was taking this video from, I had to overlay it, but you can see, where I've got the 2 different shots, and this is how it would figure out. Foremost of the builders, one of her titles, she was of course a goddess of maths and accounting. The palm frond, so that's your palm frond, but when you strip it, essentially it's a tally stick. So when you see whether it's Seshat or Thoth, with this palm frond, it's a counting tool. Again, you see the scribe's tools as well in her hand. She was the inventor of writing. There's multiple images of Seshat here at the Temple of Seti I. I would think that the number cults, the academies of Seshat, the goddess math, geometry, architecture, etc., and the Temple of Seti I next to the Siron seems to be, at least in my opinion, one of these where it was still happening. By that time, she had diminished. She had, so Osiris and Isis were now really popular, but the old gods from the Old Kingdom, even prior to the dynastic period, seem to have faded. Like Atum and etc. become less and less popular, and then it moved into Anubis, Isis, Osiris. But here we see Seshat, that Attaboy, instructing Thoth on writing. She invented it. Thoth taught it to humanity. These are more images again of her with the stylus, the writing tool, and I think there's something interesting with the way she holds her pen. So back to the 0 point. This is all based on the seasons, and now we see this is so it looks like a male figure, but it's Hatshepsut, a female pharaoh, stretching the cord, arranging a new temple there with Seshat. So Seshat would always assist the pharaoh in creating this. Now you would note this is from the later period, but we see the symbol is it has the old style with the 2 sticks basically pointing up. But what's different is you see that the 7 points now are basically at 45 degrees from each other. The old style is like this. This is from the weapon Efret, and these are one of the very, very old depictions of that Seshat symbol. So just to zoom in, you can see how it's basically 45 degrees, but the older version is less of an angle. Lots of work done. The concept of Mesketu, stretching this cord, arranging the temples to the north. So this can be just like with ancient Indian architecture. They would arrange their temples using a gnomon, basically a stick in the ground, and you can trace out the movement of the sun. Then you can find east and west and use a north star to find north, but also if you were to leave it there and measure it over the year, you could also get the solstice and the equinox pattern. And that's what I think, well, there's an interesting little connection in regards to these symbols in here. So you'll notice how, okay, I'll show you. So your 0 point, where the solstice, equinox and winter solstice all come together. If we overlay that, this older symbol very closely matches those particular angles. It's not at 45 degrees like, for instance, here. the later period, the older ones, have the leaves bunched more together, and they very closely match that solstice, equinox, winter solstice arrangement. And of course we have the sighting tool to find north, as in the stretching the cord ceremony. We observe the movement of the stars. We align our temple to Mesketu, the north. Just a couple of days ago I posted a video on the opening the mouth ceremony ritual, and how the actual tool called Mesketu reflects the bull's foreleg, or the Big Dipper as we call it now, which is how sailors, navigators, find the North Star. So Temple of Seti, Abydos, that same type of architecture, just like with the pyramids. And if we look at Heliopolis, earlier video, how not just the three pyramids at Giza, but also these other pyramid fields, pointing not just to Heliopolis, but to the sacred mound, the Ben Mound, creation point of the Ennead. Here's some photos, some recent excavations at Heliopolis, and there you can see, for instance, you see the size of these limestone blocks and compared to the size of a man there. So it was the huge walls temple complex at Heliopolis was the primary source of the building of Cairo. The casing stones of a pyramid were used, but they were on the other side of a river. We still see just the surviving stone here, and if you look into heliopolisproject.org, where they found the surviving bits of the wall was huge, and that doesn't include the temples inside. Strabo's geometry, as well as Herodotus, speak of the Heliopolis as a center of learning. Herodotus, for the people of Heliopolis are said to be the most learned of the Egyptians. The whole place was full of obelisks. If you want to see the obelisks of Heliopolis, best off going to Rome. For instance, they're in the front of a Pantheon. And all these, not all of the Lateran obelisks, for instance, come from Karnak, but there are multiple obelisks from Heliopolis in Rome. We also find one in Florence. There's only really one surviving one in Heliopolis now, and a stump of another. But also Cleopatra's Needles of London and New York. They were brought from Alexandria, but those were transferred from Heliopolis to Alexandria, and there they stood for 2,000 years before being moved to New York and London. So Heliopolis, primary sanctuary of the goddess Seshat, the goddess of wisdom, knowledge, geometry, astronomy, surveying, construction, foremost of the builders as she was called. So we looked at Khafre Valley Temple, the Osiron, have that style of architecture, but what did Heliopolis look like? And we can get, so here are some cuts from Strabo where he visited and he describes it, and we can just narrow that down to a few important bits. And it contains the ancient temple constructed in the Egyptian manner. Also he references the obelisks. It was basically a forest of obelisks. If you go to Karnak, for instance, that's where most obelisks are, and there's only a handful of them there. If you wanted, in ancient times, if you wanted to see obelisks, you'd go to Heliopolis. So it contains the ancient temple constructed in the Egyptian manner. After the sphinxes, one comes to a large propylum. That's a gate. So again, these trapezoid doorways and gates. So this is an image, older image at Karnak, common theme. That's the typical Egyptian style. Throughout its whole length, a stone sphinxes placed in order on each of its two sides. So rows of sphinxes, just like Luxor or Karnak, very traditional, the typical Egyptian manner. But what's interesting is when you come to this passage, there is also a kind of hall with numerous columns, as at Memphis, for example, which is constructed in the barbaric manner. 4. Except for the fact that the columns are large and numerous and form many rows, the hall has nothing pleasing or picturesque, but is rather a display of vain toil. Very much in the form of the Khafre Valley Temple or the Osiron. You don't have these hieroglyph covered walls and columns. What we have is a barbaric manner, nothing pleasing or picturesque, a display of vain toil. Very similar to the pyramids, which are, for their size, is amazing, but there is no decoration, there is no writing, there are no pictures on there. but there is a form of writing, and that is geometry and arithmetic, music, and astronomy, especially accessed through the metrology for the measures. Thoth and Seshat, gods of wisdom, knowledge, gods of weights and measure, geometry, astronomy. I'll link this video in the description where I go through the math inside just the Great Pyramid, but also the Lucas and Fibonacci series, which actually links Menkaure Pyramid and Khafre Pyramid to the Red Pyramid, the Bent Pyramid, the Maidum Pyramid, as well as all the others such as Pepin, Neferefre, etc. And phi, pi, all these important mathematical constants. Even pi over 6 meters equals 1 Egyptian royal cubit. That's also in the pyramid. 4 over pi, which gives you the relative size of the Earth and the Moon, but also is the distances between the inner planets, like the astronomy of the planet. It's not just Sun and Moon and Earth, it's also the other planets as well. I'll link that video in the description. That's part of a longer series, Understanding the Great Pyramid and the Ancient Sciences. It's too much to condense, but if you just, if you're really interested, I know there's a lot of videos, a lot of time there, but if you go through, you'll see, I go through it with the measures and compare it to other ancient texts. It's measurable, it's testable, it's tangible, and if you build up a larger case, at some point coincidence ceases to be coincidence, and it becomes clearly a pattern. Seshat, the Lady of Letters, foremost of the builders, the goddess of, mistress of the house of architects, keeper of the houses of life, all the record keeping, the libraries and the books. These are all in her dominion, and it's so the only ancient goddess that could be responsible for all of this really is Seshat. Now also Thoth would be included, but when it comes to this architecture, the astronomy, the math, it's all really only place could be is with her. And as with the Platonic, and essentially the same thing was happening with the Pythagorean academy, the language essential element was geometry, mathematics, astronomy, surveying, construction. It's all points to Seshat, but there's also, Seshat seems to be pointing to something, and you see she was the inventor of writing, and she holds the pen or the stylus, and I think there's something else happening in here as well. And geometry, geo, earth, metry, measure. So we come back, the reason for the seasons, so whether it's the 3 seasons of ancient Egypt or spring, summer, autumn, winter, as most people have, the reason for this is the tilt of the Earth, 23.5 degrees, where that's why the Tropic of Cancer, 23.5 degrees north of the equator, Tropic of Capricorn, 23.5 degrees south of the equator. So when it comes to the solstice, the sun will go down a well at 23.5 degrees north or south of the equator. It won't. After that, it's going to cast a shadow. So Egyptian mystery schools, Thoth, Seshat. Now, how does this, of course, relate to more modern mystery schools, esoteric organizations? And here's pretty much a standard Masonic tracing board. Of course, we have the compass, we have the levels to find vertical, the level of a plumb line to find horizontal, the building square, the stoneworking tools, of course the compass, and most importantly the ruler. Thoth, Seshat, gods of weights and measure, just like Hermes, just like Nuar and Fuzi in ancient China, the same themes, where these gods of knowledge being closely related to astronomy, etc. And also note the stairway here, 3, 5 and 7. That's an important feature because that will link to other elements as well. Here's another tracing board. Now if I go back a moment, you see the 2 main pillars. Now there's actually a 3rd column, the ionic, but here we have the 2 main columns where we have the celestial and the terrestrial sphere. Or is that's the terrestrial, that's the celestial, I believe. But we'll get a closer view when we look at this particular one. Now we see the 2 columns, and we have the terrestrial sphere or the Earth, and we have the celestial sphere. And it's a bit hard to make out. I'll show you a better one in a moment, but we have the zodiac signs running around the outside there. And This is a common theme. So here's another type of tracing board. Notice 3 steps, 5 steps, and then 7. Also this Egyptian form of architecture. But we have the 2 pillars, 2 columns, the earth, and you can get a hint of these constellations in there. That's the celestial sphere and that's the terrestrial. Here's another example, 3, 5 and then 7 steps to 2 columns, the earth sphere and the celestial sphere. You can see closer, more accurate, the zodiac signs. And you'll notice that the earth is tilted and the celestial sphere is also tilted. This is an important repeated theme. But also for 5 steps as they relate to the 5 orders of Roman architecture: Tuscan, Doric, Ionic, Corinthian and Composite. Now then we have in the middle Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, they're Greek orders, but the 5 orders is Roman. But you'll also note hearing, seeing, feeling, smelling and tasting, how they relate also to the senses. These 7 steps, we have grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, astronomy, music, and then geometry. It's a bit hard to read, but they're the 7 liberal arts. And the top 4 of those steps, arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry. That's the quadrivium. So a celestial and terrestrial sphere. Now, for instance, here in New South Wales, in Goulburn, you'll often find this in older architecture when Oddfellows, Freemasons, etc. were more prominent. But notice the obelisk, but we also have the tilted spheres on either side. This is a common theme in architecture, terrestrial and celestial. And this also relates to the tilt of the earth, and I'll show you more. But the reason for the seasons, whether it's the solstice, equinox, well, this is the tilt and this important angle. Now it's actually 23.43 or floating around there, but 23.5 is good enough for all purposes. Here's another more modern mason board, obviously during the computer age. We see again the tools of geometry and measure, and also note Jacob's ladder, which is an important feature of biblical tradition as well. But if we overlay that there, it's at that tilt. This is one of these hidden in plain sight things. If you've been around the internets for a while, you've probably stumbled upon the symbolism in the US dollar. Notice the pyramid, which there's a lot going on in there, but if we just, well, that's tilted at 23.5 degrees. It's representing again this tilt of the earth, which is so important to precession and to astronomy and the seasons and understanding calendar, natural calendar. But of course we also have the compass and square, common Mason symbol. Now the angles of a compass will vary. There is not a fixed angle, but what you'll see very often, very common, is this particular angle, which is 47 degrees, which is 23.5 times 2. So if we use the inside edge of that, it fits in. Now even from the point and the outside edge, well, there's information in there too, but that's basically 6 degrees. I covered that earlier. So what we have is this important, whether it was modern Masons, Rosicrucians, going back to the 7 liberal arts schools at places such as Chartres and Cologne, these other secret schools, academies, going back through time, back to Plato and Pythagorean academies. And again, they emerged, and they even state themselves, the old writers, that this knowledge emerged from Egypt and Babylon, Sumeria, also India. India is very important. But back to Temple of Seti I. So inside we have the famous image of raising the Jed. That too is tilted at 23.5 degrees. Now the dollar bill and the Jed is, it's been out there for a while, but also if you might notice that Thoth, who's the male equivalent of Seshat, he carries the 2 wands. Now wand in ancient language translates to measuring rod, and he has the lower and upper Egypt crowns, bringing those together. Now note the angle separating them. It is the same angle of these compasses. It's a very common theme in architecture and symbolism. That's 6 degrees and can be found also in at the Giza Plateau itself, Wall of the Crow, inside the pyramid. Well, it's a repeated thing. Earlier episodes in the series on the plateau. So for Jed, we also have that is now this image that I used here. I have others, and to find, notice that when you use these, either you have to be on site with a tool, or finding what is perfectly horizontal. Well, you have to sort of rely. So this image is actually sort of seems to be tilted a bit. You can use, or for instance, these lines. Now I have other images which perfectly fit. This one's just a fraction off, but I could have chosen another image and it would have fitted perfectly. But I'm just now declaring that when it comes to these images I'm about to show, the camera has to be level, has to be on level ground, and it all has to be, because if it's a slight angle tilted up or down or side to side, it is going to affect it. I could have chosen another image that matches perfectly, but this one is very, very close. But it also depends on how level was the shot taken, how the position of the camera. Now back to the celestial sphere. So this all has to do with the tilt of the Earth from the vertical, but the same 23.5 degrees also affects the way we view, for instance, the 12 signs of the zodiac around the ecliptic. We're also seeing a 23.5 degree tilt. So one's vertical, one's horizontal. The Earth vertical, the constellations of the zodiac are horizontal, and the reason for the seasons, yeah. Okay, so 23.5 degree tilt. So that's why where it's Orion, Taurus, etc., don't go directly over the top. They're at a tilt, which is the tilt of the Earth. So it brings it. So he's Seshat and Thoth behind one of the colossal statues at Luxor. That recent video I did on the Mesket-U and the symbols there, you find that's the Mesket-U symbol as well as the ads and how it relates to northern stars. Also the Mesket-U tool, how that relates to stretching the cord and finding north. But so here's two. What you'll find is that Thoth will, as a rule, might be some exceptions, holds his stylus, his writing instrument, at a slightly higher angle than what Seshat does. And this is an important aspect because, again, it's difficult to get a photo that's precise. Now I have another angle again that would fit that 23.5 degree tilt much more precisely, but I'm just using that one, and again just declaring that this relies on the photo or being able to go on site and measure it much more accurate. But that's just one example. Now there are other, for instance, this is also this is Temple of Seti the First, where we see Seshat with the palm frond. Note that again, finding the horizontal, when people take these films, the camera has to be perfect. But if I've just mirrored the image there, and again that's matching very closely. If I was to tilt that photo to find the horizontal, it actually would come pretty much spot on. Seshat again holding the pen, stylus. That too comes very, very close, depending on again how horizontal, how level it is the camera, and how it has to be precisely centered on that position if you were to use this type of method. But there are so many other similar examples where Seshat's stylus is at a slightly lower angle than Thoth, and it's matching basically the horizontal of a celestial sphere. Seshat, Heliopolis, High Priest, Chief of the Observers, the Imhotep, etc., all there. The Egyptian mystery schools at 0 point, the Platonic schools, Pythagorean, Thales, etc., these linking to other cultures who, in the sacred numbers embedded in Hindus, Buddhists, Jains, Sikhs, also in the Mayan system, and of course in Sumerian and the Greek system, Greek weights and measures. I linked the harmonic series that I did, and one of the episodes, if I remember rightly, I included it, or I go through all the weights systems of the Greeks and the Romans and how they divided up their units of weight, and it's all based on this particular method, the harmonic numbers, which were in, again, Vitruvius and these type of texts, treatise on weights and measures by Theosophanes, forget the exact pronunciation, speaking of the importance of these numbers and how it was in their weights and measure systems. Even old texts describe this as well. The connections between timekeeping, the compass and the clock, and the similarities, 60 minutes, 60 seconds, etc. Linking to geodesy, geometry, which is not just in the pyramid or the Giza Plateau pyramid, but also how it relates to this most sacred site of Heliopolis. And of course, Heliopolis, those plans I went through in the earlier, I'll add this to the Unlocking the Giza Plateau series, where I go to Thebes, Abydos, Elephantine, and also speak about these other studies on archaeoastronomy in Egypt. And of course, that earlier symbol of Seshat, stretching the cord ceremony, and how it very nicely ties into this solstice equinox symbolism, and that of course being her domain. Obelisks, yep, so the Osirian, Khafre Temple, or the Great Pyramids, they don't, or Heliopolis, as I showed, no writing, no pictures, but if you apply metrology and geometry to them, you'll see that there is a very clear geometric pattern which encodes very profound geometric mathematical knowledge. Again, I'll link that in the description. Seshat,